not easy.
It was not easy.
But Gerald,
Yeah.
yeah, but we're retired. We don't have to get up at 8 o'clock in the morning. We can go anywhere at 8 o'clock in the morning.
I always get
You gotta start getting up at 3:55 like I did today.
3:55.
I had to be in the lab setting up IT. I had to walk the dog for her walks, like 45-minute walk every morning. She has to have one. And then I had to be in the lab at 5:55, so I could be there to do the transition because we're sanitizing our printer copy scanner. You know, government standard, you have to sanitize everything on it in order, like from the digital side, in order to replace it with a new one. And since we don't have IT people anymore because they left during COVID, and we are not allowed to rehire someone to fill that role, it's my job now. Yeah. And then we have like 40 people working the lab today on split shifts, so I have to be in there out before they get there. So.
Oh, gee. I get the
Cool.
phone, but
This is
nothing
looking
like
good.
this early.
If you just start the slide deck and let it rest on slide 1.
Okay, so I need to plug in.
Yeah, the
This is
HDMI only. Good
okay.
to go. Yeah.
Let's see, Roger.
Yep, that's it. Roger's the last one.
Okay.
Cool. I'm really excited, Jerry, and I'll have to tell you, you can be thinking about it before you present, but I'm going to be asking you about the juxtaposition of climate change and World War II, and not for you per se, but what you see as a connection or a link in your research, if you've noticed anything so far. So you're going to have to answer that question, unfortunately. So I'm prepping you for it.
Okay, yeah. Give me a heads up. So, yeah.
Good morning, Zoomies, Zoomy Roomies. Hey, Dave, I'm sorry about the meeting.
Oh, no worries, Beth. I went and found that email and it was there. I just somehow missed that because it was, like you said, a little bit deeper in. I just somehow missed that date. So sorry about that.
No, that's no problem.
So yeah, no, it's so what I guess what I'll do is I saw your email this morning, but I haven't had a chance to read it yet. So I'll
okay.
Really, and so looking at that last reapplication, correct? That's really what we have.
Yeah. So, we funded. We're recommending the Angie. We're recommending the RSVP, and then we agreed to do funding for Luna Cultura, but they're going to have to find the rest of the funding somewhere else because they wanted like $7,000, and
yeah, that's too much.
Yeah, and so we agreed to fund contingent on them finding other Rotary sponsors. And so Jay's going to try to talk to the other Rotary clubs, see if they can help them in for a program.
Touches differently than mine.
Gotcha. That sounds like a good plan.
It's a good organization. Just we can't fund things that big.
Right. Yeah. Unless we put all of it in one basket. But it looks like Jay's starting here.
Yeah.
If you could pop me back over to Zoom there, or the presentation, I should say. Perfect. All right, thanks all. Welcome. Wow, we're really heavy on that side of the room today. All right. If anyone wants that one chair there by Ellen, then it's available. It's okay. All right. Well, we'll get started today. Just to let you know, we're all being recorded. So anything you say will be on the internet. Be aware. Meeting agenda real quick. Go through our normal and announcements, and then we'll jump on the Happy Buxton program. So we'll start off with a pledge. Pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, if you remain standing real quick, we'll do the four-way test of the things we think, say, and do first.
Is it true? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Will it be beneficial to all concerned? And will it be fun?
All right, be seated, please. Thank you so much. All right, I think we might have a couple guests today. We have John, but John's close to not being a guest anymore, so that's awesome. I know. We have a speaker, so we won't mention it. Oh, awesome. You want to introduce your guest?
Not my guest, but this person needs no introduction, the esteemed.
I can't remember his name. Thanks, really good to see you. Awesome. And then, please, you there, you're.
Yeah, Maureen is here, so be nice to her.
Awesome. Always good. And then obviously Paulette. So
Yes.
wonderful.
Oh,
Oh, he's hiding. He's hiding. He's bashful. So awesome. Thank you all. We have a Rotary Minute today by Terry.
Oh, yes.
So Terry, go ahead. I'll let you take the floor.
It's not, I don't know how much is a minute, but anyway, how I got into Rotary. That guy. So I was a Rotarian. I was not a Rotarian, and I came after that, but I was still working at home raising children, so I didn't join Rotary, but I went to all his stuff. And then, so when he was president of the Boulder Rotary, we went to the International Convention in Buenos Aires and took all 3 children.
Oh, wow.
And I don't remember the order, but that's the part that sticks with me is the internationalness of Rotary. And we've been to 5 international conventions.
Wow.
And when he was district governor, we went to Copenhagen. And, or was that my president year? I forget. All blends together, but it's that international flair that got us going in this. And also what I enjoyed a lot was at his district governor training of which spouses had to go to. And I was really overwhelmed because I was just finishing seminary. Our oldest was a senior in high school and checking out colleges, and I'm waiting for a job. And I'm thinking, how am I going to be a spouse to the district governor? But it all worked out. And Nora said the main reason he wanted me along to all the club visits is so he could use the HOV lane. Very, very, very convenient. But I did, when I did, and I thought I had to be employed to be a Rotarian. And so I waited until I had a call to a church, but that little tiny church in eastern Colorado in Anton obviously didn't have a Rotary Club. But when I picked up Ebenezer Lutheran Care Center as another half-time job in Brush, they met right there at Ebenezer. So that is when I became a Rotarian officially and joined that club in Brush. And what I was enjoying a lot, and especially my year as president, I shouldn't have said that, but the 3rd year I was there, I was president. It was also my last year in Brush. But what was exciting for me was back, and I don't know what's happening since COVID, but they had these group study and vocational exchange groups that would come from other countries and experience how we do things. And they loved coming out to Brush because it was these wide open, they just like were in awe of these wide open spaces that drive out there. And they got to ride horses and go to dairy farms and do all these things. And then because it's a small town, I just decided to write up an article for the paper. And they just thought that was the most awesome thing, to the point that that was a highlight at the district conference. And they made a presentation. We got in the newspaper because this particular group was from Hong Kong. And so, you know, It's gonna get in the paper in a month. So anyway, that is my highlight, and I was asked to be on by then it was changing to just vocational exchange groups. I was asked to be on the district committee, but I was changing jobs and I just didn't think that was a good time, but someday maybe. That's my Rotary minute.
Thank you very much, Tara. That was a really wonderful minute.
Yeah.
And I think it was close to a minute.
It is, it is.
So today is the day, and we have a lot of people here, so it's a good day for a vote. Today is the bylaw change vote that we pitched to the whole club. So for those who are members of this club, the proposal 2 weeks ago was to change the language surrounding board meetings and not to be limited to first Tuesday, but to be able to be something that the board could then vote upon and select that date. And that's something that we had noticed that over the last several years it hadn't been observed always on that first Tuesday, and there was need for us to make the language more specific to the actual function of the board. Still going to be on the calendar. It'll still be something that we notify everyone of. It'll just be not the first Tuesday because it hasn't been. So at this point, we would have to do a momentary call to order. We have a motion to call to order for the vote.
So moved.
Thank you. Second. Awesome. Great. It'll be written down somewhere in the ether. All right. From here, the all in favor of the modification to section 4 of the bylaws, say aye and raise your hand.
Aye.
All opposed? All abstaining? No one. Awesome. Passes. Great.
I
think we have
assume
more
you
than enough
guys
people.
on.
Oh, do we have anyone online that wants to, I got a thumbs up. Hey, that's great. I'm down for that. Well, even if you said no, I'm sorry if you're online because they just overruled you. All right, so anyone motion to close the votes? Seconds? Bingo, all right. I'm not gonna vote on that, because I think everyone wants to move on, so let's go for it. Cool, so that's changed. So we'll keep you notified, but the bylaw change and modified section is now adopted. Thank you very much. And it is in our bylaws and constitution that we have to do that during meetings. So just as a reminder, that's how we do things. All right, so we have a couple of district announcements that are a follow-up from last week. Today, the membership summit follow-up is happening. So I don't know, Bob, are you going to be there?
Yeah, I signed up.
Awesome. Ann, are you there?
Yeah.
Great. I'm not going to go. I'm just going to be honest. I got the Ryla one this week, so I'm going to jump on that one.
You can delegate it to some people.
Well, we've got a membership committee chair there.
Right,
So
yes.
I'm happy with that. Tomorrow there's one on finding commonality that should be interesting. So if anyone's available for that one, and that one I think will be super interesting because it's not something that we think of a lot in Rotary, but it's definitely something that's important in our communities right now. And then the Rotary 101, which I know Paulette and Ann went to, the last one is going to be held on Tuesday the 9th. And that one I think should be super exciting. That it sounds like it was really great last time, and I definitely encourage anyone that even if you've been a member a long time or a very short amount of time, might be worth going to because maybe you'll learn something, right? There's always something to learn about Rotary, right?
That's true.
And then using social media, if you want to know how to use social media for the club, or maybe not just for yourself, I'm sure that they'll take some questions there on the 7th of December. So
Are all these found on this
district email and district website.
district website?
Yeah, and then they're all Zoom. So fortunately, everyone should be pretty used to Zoom at this point in our club.
And they're all recorded.
Yeah, and they record them and they post them on the website if you kind of miss them. But yeah, so those are all available and they're mostly at 7 to 8, except for that finding commonality one tomorrow. So awesome. From there, I'm going to skip all the stuff for next year. We'll do that again next month. From there, we've got Happy Bucks. So for those who are unfamiliar with Happy Bucks, it is a time where you might throw in $1 or $2 or 20 and say something for the good of the order or a positive announcement. We've had some grumpy bucks lately, and I like to minimize those as much as possible. But get us started. I got Terry over here. Get you started over on
I'll
this side.
put one in for Norris and I, but we celebrated vicariously our baby's 30th birthday. Mariah turned 30 on All Saints Day, Monday.
Oh.
Yeah.
Mom is turning 91 on Friday.
Oh.
Wow.
Oh my goodness. I have $1 for some. I have $5. So I am thrilled again that Paula is here with Clive, and it's our 3rd visit, so you know what that means.
So my sweet husband just had a spine surgery last Thursday, and he's feeling very well, but oh my God, he can't do anything. So he's calling me naughty, which I love, it's better than ratchet, but anyway. And also, I got food, so please help yourself.
Thank you.
Yep.
It's yummy.
Anybody down there? Sure, go for some.
I'm just happy to be anywhere, but particularly here.
Good. Oh,
Sorry.
Oh, so I'm happy that Lorraine is here and Jerry's here to tell us an interesting story or two.
I got
I got a happy 5 for the 5 kids that came trick or treating. Most of our candy.
It's just so good to see Lorraine Norris, Val, I haven't seen him in a while, John, Paulette, Ellen. It's just good to see you.
coming this way.
Birthday check.
Oh.
Is that a cranky check?
Yeah,
I made it this far.
$18. And then I've got some happy bucks. Thank you for hosting us yesterday, Kim, for the board meeting.
Any Zoomies have anything to say? An O?
No one mutes. Oh yeah, so thank you, Kim, for
Oh, wait.
having us. And then Leslie,
Beth-
thanks for having me
Beth
over yesterday
unmuted.
to work on this. Anyone online?
Beth.
Beth.
I was just gonna say, I have a Grumpy Happy, which is that we found out my 6-year-old grandson got COVID from his birth father who refused to be vaccinated, but his symptoms were mild and he is okay. And so it's a Grumpy Happy.
Glad he's okay.
Can
And
I just mention about John?
yeah,
Okay,
please.
so I spoke to John Olson yesterday, and his mother passed away.
Yes.
And she had COVID, living at the Holbrook community. They had 18 cases there. And John has, and he's up, she had Alzheimer's, so he's sounds relieved, actually. He's been taking care of it for the last 5 years. But John has COVID also. And I think it's a great situation. But he sounded very up, and he said he is taking antibodies, and but he's still with us. He just not here. He appreciates all.
Yeah. John's been
Just
definitely
want you to know.
a force in our club the last couple months, you know, coming back really strong and helping with the 25th anniversary project. So it was all there for him. And thank you everyone who's checked in on him. I appreciate that.
What is the update in Jillian Jocelyn? Does anybody
I
know?
called yesterday, just left a message on her cell phone. And I said, hopefully when she feels up to it, she'll give me a call.
She's in the hospital for a week, and Rich
Right.
had,
Oh, yeah.
and in a hospital, in surgery centers, his procedures, and hers is huge, it's the whole back.
Yeah, it's,
So she's in the hospital for a week.
so
So
if I
hard
learn
for
anything,
you
I'll let you
guys.
know.
If anybody just,
Yeah, that's what she did.
Is she?
Yeah.
So, just keep her in your prayers, so that's a big.
Yeah, it's a surge for us right now because I feel like with all the surgeries that are non-COVID related, it's only been the last several months that we've been able to have those scheduled. So I feel like we're all feeling it right now. A lot of people are going in for stuff that they weren't able to do last year. Well, I'm happy that everyone's in our club doing all right. I'm really sad about John's mom. So I know that he's been talking to me about that for a while. So I'm glad that he's doing okay though. and he's recovering from COVID. So. Well, today we have an awesome guest speaker that touches on multiple parts of our culture here in Boulder, so I'm sure we'll get into that as well. But Herb, did you want to do an introduction?
I got it.
Perfect.
I'm ready. So Jerry Meehl is a climate scientist at NCAR. His hobby is World War II history, and he's authored or co-authored 5 books. They are Pacific Legacy, Pacific War Stories, Fast Boat, and Fast Times. Isn't something about women supposed to be in that title?
PT boat skipper and a buddy at John Kennedy's. Those guys were pretty party.
Oh. A Shanghai American and 1 Marine Award. He has written more than 300 articles on scientific and historical subjects, has traveled extensively throughout the Pacific during the last 4 decades, and has photographed every major Pacific island battlefield, as well as many other locations related to World War II in the Pacific. His photographs have been published in numerous journals and periodicals. He received his PhD from the University of Colorado, and he was on the science team of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is awarded the Nobel Prize in 2007.
Wow.
So he is a Nobel laureate. So what Jerry did was write chapters in several of the initial IPCC reports that were submitted. So that's really a tough job because you have to read all the other papers, assimilate the information, and put in a coherent structure in which everybody agrees. So, it's not an easy task, as well as doing your own. So this, Jerry's gonna, so we asked him to talk about climate change. He said, no, let's talk about something else. So he's gonna talk about his authorship of the war in the Pacific, and these are human interest stories. One of which, I don't know how many of you know that there was a Japanese language school at CU. And during World War II, I believe that there were barracks. Quonset huts at CU at one time. Did they?
No, they were in Baker Hall.
That's when I was at CU. That was the athletic game. Anyway, I was not in Baker, but I came here to ski. I mean, go to school. So the story is about Bob Sheets, who grew up in Shanghai, became a battle interpreter in the 2nd Marine Division. I'll let you. Jerry Meehl.
Yeah, so like Herb said, I ran into him at the Colorado Music Festival concert. He goes, hey, you should come give a talk at Rotary on climate. I said, I already did that. I said, I'm on a different topic. I said, talk about my hobby. So yeah, this guy Bob Sheets. So in the course of doing all these books, I probably interviewed over 100 World War II veterans. And I think Bob is the most interesting one of them all. He has a lot of really interesting stories. And I think he may be the only one I've interviewed who's still alive. He's 99 years old. He lives in San Jose, California. And he's determined he's going to make it to 100. So his birthday, his 100th birthday is next April. So we're already planning to go out there to San Jose to celebrate his 100th birthday. So I ended up putting together this biography, and it did actually, it was a finalist for the College Book Award in 2013, which is kind of a surprise. So I think that other people, the stories resonate with other people as well. And then levels and talk about things. So next slide, please. Right arrow.
Right arrow.
Right. So this story starts for me with Bob Sheets in the Malaysian state of Sabah, which is in northern Borneo. And I met Bob there, and we'll talk about that in a second. Bob's locations where he was participating in World War II, 2nd Marine Division was initially training in Wellington, New Zealand, and then they went and invaded the little atoll of Tarawa. Then they went back to Hawaii where they did more training. Then they came back and invaded Saipan and the neighboring island of Tinian. Tinian was the island where they built B-29 bases, where the B-29s that dropped the E-bombs on Japan took off from. And so then he ended up growing up in Shanghai. So those are some of these locations. Next slide, please. So I was sent out by NCART as part of this international monsoon experiment called MONEX in the late 1970s. And they sent me with the NCAR portable weather station to this little town of Bintulu, which is in the state of Sarawak. And Sarawak and Sabah are the two Malaysian states on the northwest of Borneo. The rest of Borneo is part of Indonesia. So I was sitting there in this little place, and the MIT Doppler radar was set up there as well. And here was part of our team there, and that's me on the far right. This guy, Frank Marks, was a grad student at the time at MIT. He is now the director of research at the National Hurricane Center, and he holds the record for most eyewall penetration of hurricanes in research aircraft and many other living human beings. So that's his. He said that's going to be his legacy. He says he's going to have the record for most eyewall penetration. So I was there working, and it was not a real scenic spot. It's on the north coast, and the beaches weren't real good, but I heard that up the coast in the state of Sabah, the beaches were nicer. And so next slide, please. I went up to Sabah. I went to this beach, Tanjung Aru, which is right by Kinabalu, which is the capital of Sabah. I was walking down this beach, and a motorboat came zooming in from, they've been out on one of these little islands. They ran right up on the beach, and these 4 guys jump out of this motorboat, and they're grabbing one guy, and they're carrying him up the beach to the parking lot. They throw in the back of this Toyota, was screeching off, and they left one guy to come back down to the beach to deal with the boat. And I walked over and said, what was that all about? Oh, we were out there snorkeling on one of these islands, and we got out of the boat, and my friend stepped on a stonefish. And stonefish, these nasty little things that are flat fish, and they have these spines that stick out of their backs. If you step on them, it's really bad, because stonefish venom is one of the most lethal substances in the natural world. So this guy had lost consciousness already, and they're trying to get him to the hospital before he died. Turned out he did live. But so I was talking to this guy, and I said, well, I'll help you with the boat. And he goes, sounds like you're American. He said, where are you from? I said, Boulder, Colorado. He said, oh, I learned Japanese in Boulder. What? He goes, yeah, during World War II, he says the Japanese language school was at CU in Boulder. I said, oh, wow. So we had this Boulder connection. So we started talking. And it turns out he was there working for the Sabah. He had a contract with the Sabah government to do an aquaculture project. He was working with the Bajau fishermen, which are some fishermen that kind of have coastal villages. And they were trying to figure out a way to get them cash, to participate in the cash economy. So they were putting planting seaweed on the coral reef flats. And then they would, when they're out fishing, they would kind of monitor it. When it got mature, they harvested it, bring it into Bob's dock. He had a dock set up. He would buy the raw seaweed, then his operation would bale it and dry it and ship it to Japan and sell it. And they would extract carrageenan, which is a colloiding agent for dairy products. So that was a way that these Bajau fishermen could make money. So I kind of met Bob, and he was telling me his stories, and he had a lot of really interesting stories. So next slide, please. So Bob's father, it turns out, ended up going to Shanghai, and that's where Bob was born. But on the way to Shanghai, Bob's parents lived in Honolulu in the early 1900s. And this is a picture that actually is in Duke's restaurant in Waikiki. This is Bob Sheik's father, George Sheik's. And George, when he was there about 1915, he learned how to surf from this guy, Duke Hanamoto, who was a very famous Hawaiian surfer, Olympic swimmer. And so here he is on Waikiki, and that's Bob's father, of course, before Bob was born. So his parents worked in Hawaii for a couple of years. He was working for Goodyear Rubber, I think, and then they got a better job in Shanghai. So next slide, please. So this is where they moved. They moved to Shanghai, and Shanghai was one of the real kind of cosmopolitan cities in China. That's where a lot of the Western businesses set up. It was one of the places where the Chinese kind of allowed Western businesses to get established. And so this the street here, the Bund, is called the Bund on Huangpu River, which is the big river that flows to Shanghai. You see, these are all kind of Western style buildings, and a lot of Western businesses there. A lot of Americans were working there. And in the 30s, Shanghai was not affected by the Depression as much as other areas of the world. So if you were an American businessman like Bob Sheik's father, you were making a lot of money in Shanghai in the 1930s and living a pretty good lifestyle. Next slide, please. So here's the Sheik's family. That's there's Bob's father, who learned surfing in Hawaii from Duke. Here's young Bob and his older brother George, and his mother ended up dying of cancer in Shanghai, and that's when the family ended up moving back to the U.S. In the kind of the mid-1930s. Next slide, please. So they were living this kind of expatriate lifestyle there in Shanghai. Bob grew up with an ama, like a nanny. His brother George also had his own ama. They had servants, they had a driver, they had a chauffeur, they had housekeepers, they had gardeners. They were living for a lot of the time there in this French concession, which was kind of like an area where a lot of expatriates lived, European and American expatriates lived. It was like walking onto the Meehl neighborhood, Boulder. Really nice old Victorian homes, kind of tree-lined shaded streets. All the Americans' kids went to the Shanghai American School, so they were trying to have this American upbringing in this exotic place in Shanghai. So Bob had that. That was his childhood. Next slide, please. He had a friend named Dan Williams. Dan was a missionary kid. His father was a missionary. There were there was kind of the missionary community, and then there was the business community in Shanghai among the Americans. And Bob and Dan ended up being lifelong friends, and ended up doing a book with Dan as well, but he'll kind of recur on that story. Next slide. So what occurred that ended up having a fairly big impact on Bob was something called the Shanghai Incident in 1932. There was this tension between the Japanese and Chinese in the 1930s. And the Chinese were feeling threatened, and the Japanese were being pretty belligerent, like, hey, we're going to take you over at some point. And trying to drive the point home, the Japanese actually invaded Shanghai in 1932, and they were fighting the Chinese army for about 3 months. This went on. This was really heavy-duty combat, and this was kind of in one of the suburbs of Shanghai, and it didn't involve the expatriates, the Americans or the other Europeans that were there, and they were kind of like spectators to this combat. So George and Bob's father liked to go out and kind of spectate and watch the combat. So they would go out to these neighborhoods, and George, Bob's brother, had a camera, a little brownie camera. You take these pictures. So here's a picture he took, this kid, of these Japanese soldiers marching down the street. You can see there's some combat damage there from shelling. And so this is pretty serious combat. And they go out, and the kids would go out and try to find cartridges, brass cartridges. They were collecting. This is kids. But their bodies laying around, and they were kind of seeing all this stuff, and this is kind of the upbringing they had in Shanghai. They were seeing a lot of really kind of raw stuff there, and there was a lot of gang activity in Shanghai, and people would be murdered, and they'd pitch the bodies in the river, and they'd be walking down the Bund, and they see bodies floating by in the river, and this is just kind of part of their upbringing. Bob thinks that actually helped him survive what he saw during World War II. Kind of hardened him, but his present wife said he has this kind of barrier that you can't penetrate. And she thinks that came from his upbringing and what he saw in World War II. He kind of protects himself from emotional impacts by this kind of emotional barrier. Anyway, they were out there on these battlefields. Next slide, please. And George made this little photo album. And he has these pictures he took of battle damage out there. And next slide, please. We took this interesting picture because Bob was out there. This is Bob Sheik's, and this is his father and a couple of his father's friends. They were walking around the battlefield looking at bodies laying around. And these Japanese officers came by and said, hey, take our picture. And so they lined up and had this picture taken, which is a very strange thing. There's these Japanese officers, these Americans, and Bob, George, the little kid, took the picture. And it was interesting because the next time Bob Sheik's would encounter the Japanese military would be on Tarawa about 11 years later in World War II. Next slide. So during the Shanghai incident, there was a real critical event in Bob's life, really affected him for the rest of his life. During this combat, a number of the expatriate families left Shanghai. So this is too dangerous, we're out of here. And so a British family in the French concession, their house, they left their house and they asked the sheep to look after their house. They left their 2 Chinese servants there to kind of live in the house to kind of make sure that everything was okay. And the sheep would have to go over there and check on this house a couple times a week. So one day, Bob's father took he and George over there to check on the house. They got to the house, and you imagine this big Victorian house in this kind of nice neighborhood. Front door's open. There's a lamp in the front yard. They're going, oh, this is weird. They walk in the house is trash. And they're walking through, and they look out the French doors to the backyard, and they see this scene where the 2 Chinese servants have been taken by the Japanese, tied up onto poles, and basically roasted alive over a fire. And they were dead. And of course, their father immediately says, kids, get out of here, go back into the house. And so the father explained, well, look, the Japanese were looking for valuables. A lot of times these expatriate families, when they leave, they hide valuables in their house, and they came back with other valuables. And the Japanese were torturing the servants to get them to tell them where the valuables were. And so that instilled in Bob an intense hatred for the Japanese. And he said it was really unhealthy. He said he just really hated the Japanese. He even had a little hate shrine in his room as a kid. So he had a picture of Tojo with arrows in it, and he just had this really intense hatred for the Japanese. So this is kind of the setting for Bob leading into World War II. Next slide, please. So in the end, his mother passed away of cancer. The family, his dad moved, he and his brother, to Spokane. Bob graduated from high school there. He enrolled in Harvard. He was a biology major in Harvard. He started in the fall of 1940. His sophomore year, of course, in December 1941, Pearl Harbor was attacked. And Bob was, of course, of military age. He was thinking he was going to go into the military, but, next slide, please. This guy interviewed, Commander Hindmarsh. He was a Harvard PhD. He was a professor of international law. He actually taught in Tokyo, learned Japanese, learned Japanese. He was in the Naval Reserve, and he immediately kind of became a voice for in the Navy to say, we need a really big effort in Japanese language, interpreters for interrogation, translated documents. We're going to have to spin up because we basically have nothing. It was a very low-key language school. But he said, we're going to have to spin this up. So what he said is, his idea was, well, who would be best to learn Japanese? Well, kids who had grown up in Japan. Obviously, there was a lot of kids who had grown up in Japan, missionary kids and business, sons of businessmen. And they would probably know some Japanese, or kids who had grown up in China. They may not know Japanese, but they're familiar with the concept of Asian languages, the kanji characters, how ideograms work, and how kind of the structures of Asian languages. So he went and searched the enrollment rolls of all the Ivy League colleges to try to find males who had grown up in either China or Japan. And so he recruited people like Bob, who had grown up in China, and ended up recruiting Bob's older brother George, Bob's childhood friend Dan. A lot of his childhood friends from Shanghai ended up in the language school. And so Bob was gung ho. He signed up and he said, okay, report to the language school at Berkeley. UC Berkeley for the language school. So he did. Next slide. And he had just gotten to Berkeley. The class had just started when, in February of 1942, Executive Order 9066 came out, which meant that all ethnic Japanese had to move out of the West Coast. And this was a big impact on the language school because a lot of the instructors were Japanese Americans. So what are we going to do? So President Stearns here at CU was really perceptive. He said, I'm going to lose a lot of my students, all the males are going to go into the military. How am I going to keep my head count up? So he had approached the Navy and he said, I'll volunteer to host Navy schools and we'll get Navy students in here and that'll keep CU going. So he offered to host, there's a Navy communications school, there was a Navy B-12 program, which is an officer training program, and he ended up hosting the language school. So the language school moved from Berkeley to Boulder in 1942, and so Bob then moved from Berkeley to Boulder. And that's how the language school ended up in Boulder. Next slide. So this course, and they devised this course as a speed up thing. They decided it was going to be a total immersion Japanese course. 24/7, you're going to be speaking, eating, reading, and writing Japanese. And after about 12 or 13 months, you're going to be able to read a newspaper, you're going to be able to carry on a conversation, and you're going to know something like 1,000 kanji characters. And so that they thought was kind of a minimum requirement to become an interpreter or translator in the military. So here was this Nakamura sensei who was sensei his teacher, and Nakamura was kind of the chief instructor at CU, the language school. This is a group picture of the language school classes. This was in 1943, so they had grown to this size of about 100 or so by then. This is in front of the faculty club on campus. This is Dan Williams right here, and this is his class. He was in the class right after Bob. So in Dan's class, Bob's brother George and Dan were in that class. And here's a picture of, they would break out into these study groups with an individual instructor. And here's their instructor here, and they're sitting in the Mary Rippon Theater, having this group photo taken, nice colored photo. Here's a couple of the sensei, a couple of the Japanese American instructors. Here's Dan standing in front of, this is Baker Hall, on the west side of Baker Hall. This tree is still there, actually. It's a lot bigger now. But they were all, all the Navy, and there was only one male dorm. This was the men's dorm. And it was called Fleming Hall. Actually, they changed it later to Baker. But they were all the Navy schools were housed in Baker Hall. And they had their classes in Norland and other buildings around campus. Next slide. And this is a picture of the faculty taken at Chautauqua on a picnic. Florence Walney is here. She was kind of the chief administrator. Here's Nakamura down here. This guy is Ashikaga Sensei, who taught Bob some really nice Japanese script. And you can see a lot of the instructors here are Japanese Americans, but they did have some Anglo, white instructors as well. So, and this is their families, and they all really enjoyed living in Boulder. Next slide. So here's Bob on graduation day in Mackey, the front row of Mackey Auditorium, and here's Bob here. This is Dan when he graduated about a month later. And this is a Navy school, right? But in the Navy, the Marine Corps is part of the Navy. So the graduates were given a choice. You could either get a commission as a Navy officer or a commission as a Marine Corps officer. And so Bob and Dan had grown up in Shanghai, and the 4th Marine Regiment were these Marines who were kind of there stationed in Shanghai to look after the Americans who were there in Shanghai. And this was great duty. These Marines loved to go to Shanghai because they could live like kings. Even if you're private, you have a servant because you could afford it. And these Marines were like, these are the cream of the crop in the Marines that were in the 4th Regiment in Shanghai. And they were idolized by all the kids when they're growing up, all the American kids. And so many of the American boys aspired to be Marines when they grew up. And so Bob and Dan both said, no, we want to be Marines. We always want to be Marines. So they went into the Marine Corps. And this is actually Dan, and this is George, which is Bob's older brother. George took a Navy commission. He ended up being a translator and interpreter in Australia. And after the war, he ended up in the CIA working in Vietnam, doing all stuff that he could never tell anybody. But anyway, they were all considered intelligence officers, even though they were working on translating and interpreting. So they're in the intelligence section in the Marine and Navy. Next slide, please. So Bob went to San Diego for combat training and at Camp Elliott in San Diego. And while he was there, he met this guy, Sid Salkow, who was in his unit. His unit was kind of these odds and ends guys, intelligence officers, people who were going to be in the film units, people who were doing other special tasks. They weren't kind of rank and file Marines, but they had to all go through the combat training because they were all Marines. They all had to be able to shoot a rifle. They all had to be in combat. And that's the kind of Marine Corps ethic. So Sid Salkow was a Hollywood director. He was known as the king of the B movies. Apparently, he made a lot of Westerns. And he was married. His wife, of course, lived in Hollywood. And so on the weekends, they'd get passes. And Sid would say he'd want one of the guys to go along with him so they could double date with he and his wife. And the deal was that he would set up whoever went with him up with a date. And so Bob volunteered, getting to date a couple of Hollywood starlets. And these are, Bob has a lot of stories, but I can't tell you about this. But Doris Dowling was one of the actresses he dated. She didn't make it big as an actress, but she later married the band leader Artie Shaw. And Virginia Mayo was one he got quite close to. she was just starting her career. She had just gotten to Hollywood the year before. And her career took off kind of later in World War II. 1945, one of her big breakthrough roles was in The Best Years of Our Lives. You've seen that movie. That's with Dan Andrews, Frederick March, story of three returning World War II veterans, various problems they had. And Jenny, as Bob called her, she played the kind of floozy wife of Dan Andrews, who would wait for him. He was overseas. And one of her more prominent roles was with Jimmy Cagney in the movie White Heat. She was kind of a gun mall in that movie with Jimmy Cagney. So anyway, Bob had these kind of interesting adventures on leave in San Diego. Next slide, please. Then when he got to New Zealand, they shipped him. They put him in the 2nd Marine Division. 2nd Marine Division was in New Zealand training for what would be the Tarawa invasion, and his roommate in New Zealand was this guy, Louis Hayward. He was another Hollywood actor, so Bob could talk Hollywood because he just met these various people in Hollywood. So Louis Hayward he was actually British and became a naturalized U.S. citizen. He was married to actress Ida Lupino, who was a prominent actress, and she ended up becoming one of the few female directors in Hollywood in the 50s and 60s. And so Louis was telling him all kinds of stories about wild times in Hollywood and various things that he was doing with Ida. And that was very interesting to Bob because he could kind of trade stories with him. But Louis Hayward he was in charge of the combat photography unit, which filmed under fire throughout the 3-day Tarawa battle. And the movie they produced with the Marines of Tarawa won the Academy Award for Best Documentary in 1944. So Louis Hayward was in charge of this film unit, and here's Louis on Tarawa, a couple shots of him. This is a couple of his cameramen. This is Norm Hatch, who became a fairly famous combat photographer. But Louis was affected by what he experienced on Tarawa. And when he came back after the war, he was a changed person. And what I now know, he had this PTSD. As many World War II veterans did with PTSD, they self-medicated by drinking heavily. And he had a drinking problem. His marriage broke up to actress Ida Lupino. His career resumed, so he kept going, but he was really never the same after World War II. That was kind of a sad story. Next slide. So this is Tarawa. So this was the first amphibious invasion of a coral atoll in World War II. And these coral atolls are little bits of land that surround a big central lagoon. The Japanese had built this airstrip on this little island of Basiio. And the Marines thought this was going to be pretty easy. The Navy could just pulverize every square inch of this island with shell fire, and they thought the Marines would walk in and just kind of clean up. It didn't work out that way because the Japanese had built tremendously strong fortifications, and the pre-invasion bombardment really didn't kill many Japanese, and their weapons were intact. So the landing beaches were on this side of this little island, and this is the pier the Japanese built, and it went out to the edge of the reef. So this, you can see these LSTs are backed up on the reef. So the water was very deep out here, and it's only about 3 or 4 feet deep. And this whole area here is pretty flat coming up to the beach. So what happened was the initial waves were in tracked vehicles. The amphibious vehicles could drive right up to the beach. So they made it in relatively intact. But then the next waves were in these kind of Higgins boats, which had the drop fronts. And they didn't have enough draft to get over the reef, which they hadn't anticipated. They got stuck out here on the edge of the reef. They dropped the fronts. The Marines had to wade in 300 or 400 yards, water up to their chests, holding their guns up in the air. And the Japanese were shooting machine guns at them all the way in, and they just mowed them down. And it was just really not good. So the first morning, Bob was out on one of the ships. I remember watching with binoculars. There's no communication. It's not going well. They can see the Japanese were all pretty much alive. And by the afternoon of the first day, the assistant division commander, General Hermley, was ordered to go into the island to figure out what was happening. So Hermley picks a few people out. Sheiks, come with me. You're an interpreter. Took his staff. They get in one of the Higgins boats. They get to the end of this pier, and of course they're being shot at like crazy from the beach. So they kind of are hunkered down on the end of this pier in the shelter of the pier. And Hermley's stuck. He says, "Well, I'm not going to go in there." So he says, "Sheiks, get in there and take a prisoner and find out what's going on." So he jumps out and he's trying to go on the top of the pier because he's getting shot at, just being swept by machine gun fire. So he kind of hops down, he's crawling kind of underneath the pier, and he got about 2/3 of the way in, And you could see in the beach that everything was pinned down and nothing was moving. There's just, he says, this is crazy. I'm not going to get a prisoner. These guys are just fighting for their lives. Not even, they're not taking prisoners. So we crawled back out underneath the pier, got back out and reported to the general. Sir, I can't get in there. I suggest I'll go in a little bit later when it's a little bit more stable situation. Okay, that sounds good. So they sat out there all afternoon. And finally, Hermley decided he was going to go back out to the command ships, leaving Bob there. Says, hey, she's in the quiet stand, get in there and get a prisoner. Okay, yes, sir. So Bob's out here and overnight, at the end of the first day, it's just really bad because the Marines have barely gotten a foothold on these beaches. And what they're trying to get, of course, is this airstrip, which is the Japanese have built. And the airstrips in the Pacific were the big thing because they needed runways for the aircraft to project air power to keep moving across the Pacific. So the morning of the second day, they decided, well, we need reinforcements. Let's send in more Marines. And so the same thing happened. So these landing craft come to the edge of the reef, they unload the Marines, they start wading in, they're all mowed down. And Bob's on the end of this pier watching, he literally watched, he thought 200 or 300 Marines killed in front of his eyes. They were wading past him. And he was watching this, and they're getting shot, and they finally got in. And he goes, this is insanity. So he says, I'm not going to get in there. So he flags down one of these landing craft, goes back out to the command ship, reports in, and says, well, try going in on this side, on this green beach over here, which was, by this time, the Marines, by the middle of the second day, they'd kind of gotten to the edge of the reef, or to the edge of the runway. So Bob came in and landed on this beach over here, and then he was kind of behind the main lines here, and he was seeing a lot of other things happening. He says, okay, I got to get prisoners. How can I do this? The Japanese are in these bunkers, they're fighting to the death. And he says, combat's very noisy. He'd be yelling for we hear him, come on out. And they're fighting to death. And thought, this is really not a way to get prisoners. So that at the end of the battle, there was maybe, next slide, please. There was, I think, just a handful of Japanese POWs that were taken. Here's Bob interrogating a wounded Japanese on the beach. A lot of them that ended up capturing were wounded or shell-shocked. They were fighting to death mostly. Here's Bob in a foxhole with one of his assistants collecting documents and things. And one of Louis Hayward's film cameramen filmed Bob here in color talking to a couple of Japanese POWs on the beach. So he realized that maybe loudspeakers were the thing you have to use to try to get these Japanese to surrender. He still had this intense hatred of the Japanese, even though he kind of had his views softened by the Japanese American instructors at CU, who were really great people. So he thought, well, maybe it's just the Japanese military. The Japanese living in Japan. He still was really didn't have a good opinion of it. Next slide, please. So when he went back to Hawaii, one of his tasks as intelligence officer, one of the mysteries was how in the world could the Japanese have survived this tremendous bombardment. So Bob worked with some engineers who had taken photographs, and they produced this document, Study of Japanese Defenses on Basiio Island, Tarawa Atoll. This is from the National Archives. This document still exists. And they basically analyzed how the Japanese had built their fortifications and how you could actually work on destroying them. Next. The other thing he realized was he would need loudspeakers. So when the Second Marine Division landed in the Saipan invasion in 1944, Bob landed with invasion waves again. This is one of the things I asked him. I said, Bob, you're a skilled person, you're an interpreter, there's only a few of you. Why in the world are you landing under fire with the trades? He says, you don't understand the Marines. Everybody's a combat person. Everybody goes in. You don't get any special treatment in the Marines. So he'd be on the first waves, and he had a couple of near-death experiences on landing on the beaches of Saipan. The next slide. But he got in there with some of his language officers, and here's Bob. Here's Otis Carey, who was one of his roommates at CU in his class. Reed Irvine was also in his class at CU. John Decker came through the class at CU, and these other guys were other intelligence officers on Saipan. So they had a team of people who were trying to figure out how to capture civilians and military. Next slide. The problem on Saipan was it had this really mountainous terrain with a lot of caves. And the civilians, this is the first island invasion that had a big civilian population. There's the Japanese developed Saipan and neighboring Tinian into sugarcane islands. So there's something like 20,000 Japanese civilians living on Saipan. And so the Japanese military had scared the wits out of them and said, these Americans are animals, they're gonna torture you, rape all the women, it's gonna be really bad. So the civilians just fled and they were all hiding in these caves. And so they didn't really want to fight, but they're afraid to give it to the Americans. So part of Bob's job was to try to get civilians to come out, as well as try to get military to swim if he could, but they had to deal with these caves. The next slide. So here's the first action shot of Bob using his new technology, his Jeep mounted loudspeakers. He had a generator and he's broadcasting up to some caves in a cliff and asking them to come out. And he said, you don't use the Japanese word for surrender, that's dishonorable. You say, please come out. We have water, you're not going to be hurt. Others have come out. So you use the word come out. And you can see his other fellow Marines have their weapons slung, so they're very passive. They're not, the weapons aren't ready, they're just slung over their shoulders. And so he's trying to get people to come out. And he had luck with this system because the civilians, they didn't want to get shot by anybody. So they given a chance the civilians to come out. Military were a bit more problematic because they were more viewed in this idea of fighting to death. Next slide. And Bob had portable loudspeakers. So here's kind of a battery. He'd have a Jeep battery and he had a little megaphone that was powered by a Jeep battery he used to try to get people to come out. Next slide. And this is a picture you see a lot. This is actually Bob talking to civilians, terrified, and it was cave, trying to get them to come out. And he said to him, this is a humanitarian issue. These are refugees, they weren't the enemy. And he started realizing that, Japanese are people, and this hatred he had of Japanese was probably not healthy for him, and certainly wasn't helping him in his goal of trying to get these people to come out. This is when he was really he really started coming around to having a more approach to this as a humanitarian kind of thing, and not a combat thing. Next slide. So combat photographers love trailing around Bob because he always was talking a lot to the enemy, right? So here's Bob talking to a couple of civilians who surrendered. Here's Bob up here in a cave entrance trying to get somebody to come out. And here he is, a mortar shell just gone off behind him, and you can see he's kind of startled here. He was using his megaphones to try to get some people to come out. Next slide. Here's Bob with this young girl. Her parents were up in a cave somewhere in one of these cliffs, and he was trying to get her to plead with them to come out. You see these other Marines are thinking, what are we wasting our time with this? He would actually have to sometimes hold his fellow Marines back because they viewed their job as killing the Japanese. Bob was just getting in their way. Why are you messing around? You're just going to kill them. But Bob said, no, I can save lives of Marines if I can get someone to come out. And so we do these things where he would enlist locals to help out. Here's his commanding officer, B2 Colonel Colley. And here's Bob trying to sort out who this guy is. It turns out he was a Japanese soldier disguised as a civilian. These other civilians kind of said, this guy's not with us, he's a soldier. So the soldiers would go into a separate camp, a PW camp. Next slide. Here's some more shots of Bob kind of in action. He would get, again, help others who needed Japanese speakers to use the loudspeaker because they spoke better. At the end of the battle, there was these big cliffs in northern Saipan. Sometimes you can see documentaries of World War II, you see pictures of civilians jumping off these cliffs to their death, and one after another. And there turned out to be a lot of combat cameramen out there filming this and war correspondents. And it was a horrific thing to watch 200 or 300 civilians jump to their deaths off these cliffs. And so this actually started him thinking, or the feeling was that all Japan would fight to death. And there was a feeling that motivated the kind of push to use the A-bomb. But Bob said that, yeah, 200 or 300 people jumping to their deaths is a horrific thing. But he said the civilian population of Saipan, they got 10,000 and a couple hundred military. And so there were people that did kill themselves, but the majority actually mixed up. So the culmination of this whole thing was an event with this guy. Dave Shoup won the Medal of Honor at Tarawa. He was a gung-ho, blood and guts Marine. Bob had gotten a Japanese warrant officer to surrender, and this warrant officer was helping Bob get other military to surrender. And this Japanese officer gone into a cave and been shot by another Japanese soldier. And Shoup heard about this and couldn't understand how this could be happening. So he said, ordered Bob to bring this guy in for interrogation. So Bob brings the warrant officer in to Shoup, and Shoup says, Sheets, ask this guy why he's a traitor. Bob said, oh, no. So Bob's then trying to soften it, and this warrant officer is saying in Japanese, and Shoup had this real attitude. How he couldn't understand how this guy could be doing this. And at the end of it, Bob left with this warrant officer, and Shoup says, Chiefs, we're never going to figure out what makes these nips tick. Bob then realized, his realization, said, you know, I'm empathizing more with this Japanese warrant officer than my own commanding officer. And he realized that he used to be like his commanding officer. He was going to kill all the Japanese, and that was the end of it. But he had actually gone through this transformation that started in Shanghai. We realized that it's a humanitarian kind of issue, and that this Japanese warrant officer was more on the same wavelength with Bob than his own commanding officer. So Bob, this is at the end of the battle with the battle flag there. Next slide. Bob ended up getting a Bronze Star for saving the lives of the enemy, which is unusual because most Marines get medals for killing the enemy. Next slide. So at the end of the war, Bob returned to Harvard. He met this woman here. She actually had grown up in China as well. Her father was a diplomat in Beijing, and she was actually interned by the Japanese. She was captured and interned, and she was on one of these exchange ships where the Gripsholm ship was a Swedish ship. They were exchanging Japanese civilians caught in the U.S. for American civilians who were caught in Japanese occupied territory. She ended up passing away after they got divorced. Bob was running his aquaculture project in Taiwan. He met this woman, Bao. Next slide. Got married to her, and I put this book together with him, which was really a lot of fun because he had so many good stories. Next slide. And like I said, Bob's turned 99 in April this year. This is a picture taken in Sonoma of my wife, me and Bao and Bob. And like I said, he's determined to live behind it.
Wow.
So, thanks a lot.
Well, you know that we've gone over time, but I'm sure that people have a lot of questions. I think that it would be all right if people stuck around for a few minutes after the meeting and asked you those questions in person. I think that people love that. So if that's all right with you. The token of our appreciation for you coming. I know that it's a small world and you've been across a lot of it, but hopefully it'll be a lot of fun to have and remember talking to us. But it also serves as a great paperwork of the government because we get the staff.
Yeah, that's right.
Thank you so much, Jerry, for coming. That's the meeting is adjourned, but please, Jerry, if you can stick around a couple minutes, people I know have some questions for you. Appreciate it.
I brought a couple books if anybody wants to.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
I'd just like to say thanks for letting more people know what went on.
A lot of good positive notes about it.
Because younger generation